Evening, sir. License, registration, and proof of insurance, please.
Good evening, officer. Here you are. Is everything all right?
You got something in here you don't want me to see? We're searching without consent. State your legal reason on camera. All right. You're being detained. Detained for what? You haven't stated a reason. Shut up. Turn around. Hands behind your back. The officer didn't raise his voice because he needed to. He did it because he could. On a quiet stretch of road in the early evening, a traffic stop turned into a power play. A black man stood beside his silver Mercedes. Hands visible. Posture calm. While an officer treated him like a suspect without ever explaining why he was stopped. No traffic violation was stated. No probable cause was given. Just authority applied forcefully and without hesitation. The officer searched the car after the driver clearly said he did not consent. When the search turned up nothing, the officer didn't back off. He escalated. He reached for handcuffs. At that moment, the officer believed he was in complete control. What he didn't realize was that every word, every movement, and every decision was being recorded on body camera, capturing a stop that would soon be impossible to defend. And what the officer definitely didn't know was who he was dealing with. The man he was detaining wasn't just another driver. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't uncooperative. He was an active senior Deputy U.S. Marshal. And within minutes, this routine stop would become a case study in how abusing authority on camera can end a career. Just minutes earlier, there was nothing unusual about the drive. Malcolm Reed was heading home in his silver Mercedes, moving through a commercial corridor lined with restaurants, gas stations, and a small shopping plaza. Traffic was steady but calm. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows across the road. Malcolm drove exactly how you're supposed to. He stayed within the speed limit, used his turn signals, kept his lane. There was no aggressive driving, no sudden movements, nothing that would normally draw police attention. Then he noticed the patrol car behind him. It didn't pass. It didn't turn off. It stayed there longer than felt normal. Malcolm clocked it. But he didn't react. He didn't speed up. He didn't slow down. He didn't change lanes to test anything. He just kept driving the same way he had been. Seconds later, the red and blue lights came on. Malcolm immediately signaled and pulled over to a safe spot on the shoulder. He shut off the engine. He rolled the driver's window down. He placed both hands clearly on the steering wheel, exactly where they could be seen. He wasn't trying to make a point. He wasn't trying to challenge anyone. He was doing what experienced, careful people do when they're stopped, removing any excuse for escalation before it can start. At that moment, Malcolm had no idea why he was being stopped. But the way this officer approached would make one thing clear very quickly. This stop wasn't about traffic. Officer Tyler Grady stepped out of his patrol car and walked up to the driver's side. He didn't start with an explanation. He didn't mention speeding, a broken light, or any traffic violation at all. His eyes moved over the Mercedes first, then to Malcolm. License and registration. The tone was sharp, controlled, but aggressive. Malcolm handed over his documents without hesitation. His movements were slow and deliberate. His hands stayed visible the entire time. Then Malcolm asked the most basic question any driver is entitled to ask. "Officer, what's the reason for the stop?" Grady didn't answer. Instead, he glanced back at the car and asked a different set of questions. "Is this your vehicle? Who does it belong to? How long have you had it?" The questions weren't about traffic. They were about ownership, about justification. Malcolm answered only what was required. He didn't volunteer information. He didn't argue. Then he asked again, What's the reason I was pulled over? Again, no clear answer. Grady shifted his stance. His body language changed. He stood closer now, angled toward Malcolm instead of the car. As if testing control, he asked where Malcolm was coming from, where he was headed, why he was in the area. Nothing Malcolm had done suggested a crime, but the way the questions were framed suggested that Grady believed one existed anyway. This was no longer a traffic stop. It was an assumption in motion, and from this point on, every decision Grady made would be about proving a suspicion rather than following the law. Grady's patience ran out before any explanation was given. Step out of the vehicle. The command wasn't a request. It wasn't framed as a safety measure. It was control. Malcolm didn't argue. He opened the door slowly, stepped out, and kept his hands clearly visible the entire time. Every movement was deliberate, measured in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. Grady directed him to stand a few feet away from the Mercedes. Then, without warning, he moved in. The pat-down was rough. Grady pressed hard against Malcolm's sides, ran his hands down his arms and legs with unnecessary force, lingering longer than needed. It wasn't quick. It wasn't professional. It was aggressive. Malcolm stayed still. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. When the pat-down ended, Malcolm spoke calm, clear, and intentional. I do not consent to any search of my vehicle. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't challenge the officer. He made a record. Grady didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked toward the Mercedes, as if he hadn't heard a word. Malcolm repeated it loud enough for the body camera to capture. I do not consent to a search. Grady kept moving. At that moment, the stop crossed a critical line, because once consent was clearly denied, any search that followed would have to be justified by law. And Grady had already shown he wasn't interested in justification. He was interested in finding something. Grady opened the driver's door and began searching the Mercedes. He didn't explain why. He didn't cite officer safety. He didn't claim probable cause. He just started looking. First, the front cabin. The center console was opened and rummaged through quickly. Then the glove compartment. Papers moved aside. Items flipped over. This wasn't a quick check for something dangerous within reach. This was a search plain and simple. Malcolm stood exactly where Grady had positioned him. Several steps away from the vehicle, hands visible, body still. He didn't move toward the car. He didn't interfere. He didn't raise his voice. He repeated one thing slowly and clearly so the camera would capture it without confusion. I do not consent to this search. Grady ignored him. He leaned farther into the car, checking under the front seats. He looked into the door pockets. He opened compartments that had nothing to do with immediate safety. Nothing turned up. Instead of stopping, Grady widened the search. He opened the rear doors, ran his hands along the back seats, lifted floor mats, and looked underneath. Every movement suggested the same goal: find something, anything that could justify what he had already done. Malcolm stayed calm because he understood something critical. The more controlled he remained, the clearer the record became. And with every second that passed, the camera was quietly documenting a search that had no legal foundation at all. As the search continued, Grady started talking, not to Malcolm but to the camera. He said Malcolm seemed nervous, that he wasn't answering simple questions, that something about the situation didn't feel right. But the body camera told a different story. Malcolm wasn't pacing. He wasn't shaking. He wasn't raising his voice. He was standing exactly where he was told. Hands visible. Posture steady. Responding only when necessary. Still, Grady kept narrating, layering vague claims over empty evidence. That's a common tactic when there's no real basis. You describe a feeling without naming a fact. You suggest suspicion without committing to a reason. Grady checked under the seats again, looked between cushions, ran his hands along seams and corners. Nothing. No drugs. No weapons. No stolen property indicators. No smell. No tools. Nothing illegal. At that point, the stop should have ended, but ending it would mean admitting the suspicion was wrong. Grady closed the car door and turned back toward Malcolm, his tone changing. No longer searching. Now accusing. Instead of backing down, he chose the one move that officers make when control starts slipping. He decided to detain, and that decision made after finding nothing would become the moment everything began to fall apart. Grady shut the door to the Mercedes and turned back toward Malcolm. His tone had changed. "You're being detained." Malcolm didn't raise his voice. He didn't step back. He asked the only question that mattered. "For what reason?" Grady didn't answer. He repeated vague phrases. Suspicion. Officer safety. Non-specific concerns. Nothing concrete. Nothing that could be tested. Then Grady stepped closer into Malcolm's space and reached for his arm. Malcolm did not pull away. He allowed the officer to guide his hands behind his back. He didn't tense up. He didn't give Grady anything that could be labeled resistance. The handcuffs clicked shut. Cars passed by on the road. A few drivers slowed down. People near the shopping plaza glanced over. It was public, and it was humiliating. Grady tightened the cuffs and positioned Malcolm near the patrol car, as if preparing to place him inside. The message was clear. This wasn't just a detention anymore. It was turning into an arrest. Malcolm stayed calm, but he made sure the record stayed clear. "You're making a mistake," he said evenly. "My identity will be confirmed." Grady ignored him. At that moment, Grady believed he had regained control. What he didn't realize was that the only thing holding his authority together now was a radio call he hadn't made yet. And when that call came, everything would change. Grady keyed his radio. He spoke with the confidence of someone who expected the system to back him up. He read Malcolm's name, then the date of birth, then waited. Dispatch responded normally at first, acknowledging the information and running the check. Grady stood with his arms crossed, eyes forward, posture stiff, certain that whatever came back would justify everything that had just happened. Then dispatch asked him to repeat the name. Grady did. There was a pause. When dispatch came back on the line, the tone was different, slower, more careful. "Officer, stand by." Seconds passed. Then the words came through that changed the entire stop. "Be advised. The subject returns as active federal law enforcement. Deputy U.S. Marshal. Further verification required." Grady didn't say anything. His posture shifted. His jaw tightened. He glanced at Malcolm, then quickly looked away. Dispatch continued, instructing him to hold the scene and advising that a supervisor was being notified. Grady responded, but his voice was no longer confident. It was faster now, controlled, but edged with something else. Concern. The power dynamic had flipped. Just moments earlier, Malcolm was in handcuffs with no explanation. Now, the stop had become a federal-level complication, and Grady knew it. Because once a supervisor shows up to a stop involving an active federal law enforcement officer, every second before that moment becomes evidence. And the camera was still recording. Within minutes, a second patrol car pulled in behind Grady's unit. Sergeant Dana Klein stepped out. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice. She took in the scene before saying a word. The first thing she looked at wasn't the Mercedes. It wasn't Grady. It was the handcuffs. Then she turned to Grady. "Why is he detained?" Grady started to explain. His words came out uneven. He referenced suspicion, officer safety, indicators he never clearly defined. Klein didn't interrupt. She let him talk. When he finished, she asked a single, direct question. What was the reason for the initial stop? Grady hesitated. The answer didn't come cleanly because it wasn't there. Klein shifted her attention to Malcolm and spoke in a professional, controlled tone. She confirmed his identity through proper procedure, following the steps that should have been taken from the beginning. Moments later, the handcuffs came off. Malcolm's license and registration were returned. The detention was terminated. Klein kept the body cameras running. No quiet conversations. No shortcuts. Grady stepped back, silent now, watching control slip out of his hands. Because this stop was no longer about suspicion. It was about accountability. Malcolm didn't argue after the cuffs came off. He didn't lecture. He didn't demand an apology. He simply nodded, returned to his vehicle, and drove away. A few minutes later, he pulled into a well-lit parking lot and shut the engine off. That's when the real work began. While everything was still fresh, Malcolm documented the details that mattered. The time, the location, the sequence of events, the exact moments when no reason for the stop was given, when consent was clearly denied, when the search continued anyway, when the cuffs went on with no evidence. He didn't do this emotionally. He did it methodically. He didn't post anything online. He didn't call friends to vent. That night, Malcolm notified the appropriate channels through formal procedure. He reported that a local officer had conducted a stop with no stated legal basis, performed a search after non-consent, and attempted to detain him without probable cause. He included names, badge numbers were available, and the supervisor who responded. By the next morning, the department was already reacting. Because once a supervisor responds to a stop involving an active federal law enforcement officer, the paperwork is no longer optional. Body camera footage is secured. Dispatch audio is preserved. And people above the patrol level start asking questions that can't be ignored. The stop was no longer just an incident. It was a record. Internal Affairs opened a formal investigation within days. They didn't rely on memory. They relied on evidence. Every recording was pulled. Grady's body camera, the supervisor's body camera, dispatch audio, time stamps. Grady was interviewed first. That's standard procedure. He was given the chance to explain his decisions before investigators confronted him with the footage. He described the stop using broad language. He said the driver seemed suspicious. He claimed officer safety concerns. He suggested the search was necessary. But the video didn't support his words. The camera showed no traffic violation stated. It showed a clear refusal of consent. It showed a search anyway. And it showed handcuffs applied after nothing illegal was found. Internal Affairs asked the questions that matter. What specific violation justified the stop? What legal exception allowed the search after non-consent? Why escalate to detention when no evidence existed? Grady didn't have clear answers. That gap between what the report claimed and what the camera recorded was enough. Multiple policy violations were sustained. Grady was placed on administrative leave. His badge and weapon were surrendered. And within weeks, his career was hanging by a thread because body camera footage doesn't forget. Internal Affairs didn't treat this as a simple mistake. They treated it as a sequence of bad decisions, each one compounding the next. Initiating a stop without clearly stating a legal reason. Escalating based on assumption instead of evidence. Conducting a search after clear non-consent. applying handcuffs when the search produced nothing. Taken together, it wasn't just poor judgment, it was abuse of authority. Grady received his termination notice shortly after the investigation concluded. The letter cited multiple violations of departmental policy related to traffic stops, search procedures, and detention standards. He attempted to appeal, but the body camera footage removed any room to argue misunderstanding. His badge was gone, his patrol access revoked, and the file documenting his conduct followed him, making future law enforcement employment unlikely. On the civil side, the case moved into federal court. Malcolm filed claims for unlawful stop, unlawful search, unlawful detention, and attempted false arrest. The filing wasn't dramatic. It was chronological, clean, backed by video. The city settled. There was no public admission of wrongdoing that's standard. But the settlement included significant compensation and policy changes tied directly to what happened during this stop. Supervisors were required to respond sooner when stops escalated. Officers were required to clearly articulate legal reasons for searches and detentions. Body camera audits were strengthened, and officers with repeated complaints involving baseless stops were flagged for review. Malcolm didn't do interviews. He didn't go viral. He didn't celebrate. He returned to his life knowing one thing mattered more than anything else. This didn't end the way it did because of who he was. It ended this way because he stayed calm, kept his words precise, and let the camera record the truth. Because when authority is abused in silence, it spreads. But when it's abused on camera, accountability follows. So here's the question for you. If you were in Malcolm's place, would you have stayed that calm? Have you ever had a routine stop turn into something that felt personal? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, where patience, clarity, and evidence expose misconduct, make sure to like and subscribe. Because awareness changes outcomes.